Hey, good morning, Tracy. Had a little bit of technical difficulty, so running a couple minutes behind. So we'll give a couple more minutes for some people um, to get up and running with us. Let's see here. Here we go. All right. Good morning, Eric. Good morning, Eric. Good to see you again. I usually like to go ahead and sign on about 5 minutes till 10 to give people a chance to get on, but running a little late this morning. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Go ahead and open your Bibles to Philippians chapter 1, and we will get started. This is part 3 on our devotional series going through Paul's letter to the Philippians. And remember, Paul wrote this from a Roman prison. He would be released from this prison, but then later on be arrested again and again, and eventually beheaded by Emperor Nero. But it's interesting that he wrote Philippians from prison in Rome, and but yet the theme of the letter is joy and rejoice. Rejoice in the Lord always. I say it again, rejoice. Philippians 4, verse 4. And so, just by way of a little bit of review, remember that Philippi was a small town located in modern-day Greece. Paul founded the church in Philippi on a second missionary journey, and that story is found in the book of Acts. And this particular church was made up mainly of Gentile believers, not Jewish believers. In fact, there could have been a lot of anti-Semitism in the city of Philippi, and so there wasn't a large group of Jews in the city. And so most of the people in the church were Gentile believers. And over time, this church became probably Paul's favorite church. This is the most personal letter of any of the letters, the 13 letters in the New Testament that we have of Paul. This is probably the most personal one of them all, and so he's coming at that as writing not just as a pastor, but as really, really good friends to the people he's writing to. When the people in the church in Philippi heard that Paul was in prison in Rome, they became quite concerned, as you can imagine. Their beloved pastor was in prison in a faraway city, and they didn't know what all was going on. And so, was Paul all right? Was Paul being mistreated? Was he in good health? Was he in good spirits? Was he keeping the faith? Was he even still alive? Those would have been the questions that the believers in Philippi would have been asking themselves. And so the people in the church could not rest until they find out what was going on, and they had these questions answered. And so they gathered up an offering among themselves and sent Epaphroditus, who was probably the overseer or the pastor of the church there, sent Epaphroditus with the letter to go to Rome to visit Paul and to see how he was doing so that he could bring a report back. And so Paul's letter back to the Philippians is really in response to this letter and this gift that he had received from the believers in Philippi. From Paul's point of view, or rather from the people in Philippi's point of view, Paul was in a dangerous position. Why was he even in prison? Not only was Paul in prison, but he was in prison chained to a Roman guard. And this just wasn't any Roman guard. The Roman soldiers that he was chained to, were actually soldiers who guarded the emperor himself. And so these guards that Paul was chained to were the special forces of the day, the best equipped, best trained, best soldiers. And Paul had not seen the Philippians for 4 years. He wanted to desperately visit them, but things just kept getting in the way that prevented him from being able to visit this church that he loves so much. Life right now had not necessarily turned out the way Paul thought it would. And I think that's where we can relate with Paul. Have you been through a time in life where you look back and say, you know what, life has not turned out the way I thought it was going to turn out? Things are not as the way I wanted them to be. Have you ever, and as a result, you lose perspective, you lose focus, or maybe you even feel like you're in prison yourself. And so picture this as we read this text today. Paul was chained to an elite special forces soldier sitting in a small Roman prison cell. If the room had a window, Paul probably could not see out of it because it would have been up high. However, sitting in his room with no view, he was able to see life clearly, maybe more clearly than he had ever seen it. And so from his example of being in this prison, things not going right, we get a view of how Paul viewed his situation, and we learn from that. How can we keep a proper focus in life when things aren't going the way we think they should? And so there's 5 lessons I want to go over, but we're only going to go over 2 today, and then we'll do 3 Thursday. But 5 lessons really from Philippians chapter 1, verses 12 through 30. Today we'll look through verse 18. But 5 lessons on how we keep life in focus when things aren't necessarily going the way that we would like them to. Here's lesson number 1. Recognize things happen for a reason. Now, I'm sure Paul would have rather not been in prison, but that's where he was. But instead of complaining for being in prison, he writes these words. Look at Philippians chapter 1, verse 12. He says, "Now I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel." The word advance is a military word of taking the enemy. And here is Paul chained to these military people, and he's using this word. But think about that. He's in prison, and his first thought is, this is a good thing, because now there's an opportunity to advance the gospel. He says in verse 13, as a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard, so all the soldiers, and to everyone else, that I am in chains for Christ. Now, did Paul like being in prison? Well, no. But he understood that in all things, good or bad, God works to the good of those who love him and who have been called according to his purpose. Now, what good came out of Paul's confinement? Well, look at verse 14. Because of my chains, most of the brothers in the Lord have been encouraged to speak the word of God more courageously and fearlessly. And so Paul says, this is a good thing. The palace has heard the gospel, and when people hear my story, they're encouraged to be even more bold in the gospel. And so from his perspective, there's a reason for him being where he is. And he took pride in that. So what good came out of Paul's confinement? Well, people were starting to hear the gospel. I can't explain why things happen the way they do, but I do know this. Life is not lived by chance, but by the sovereignty of a loving God. I may not like everything that happens in my life. And many things that happen I may not be able to explain or even have an answer for. Other things that have happened could have been avoided if I would have made wise decisions. But through it all, God is in control. And in spite of me, God is working in me for my good. And so from Paul's perspective, being in prison, he could rejoice because he understood that things happen for a reason. But the second lesson we learn from this of how to stay focused in life when things are not going the way we want them to is to relinquish the results to God. Relinquish the results to God. Apparently, while Paul was away in prison, some other preachers were bad-mouthing him. Can you imagine that? Preachers bad-mouthing another preacher or talking behind their back or spreading rumors or saying things that aren't true. Well, apparently this was happening to Paul. And so in verses 15 through 17, Paul describes 2 types of ministers. So look what he says. Follow me, and you'll hear these 2 different types of ministers. Philippians chapter 1, verse 15. It is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry. That's one type. But others out of goodwill. The latter do so in love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I am in chains. And so there's these two type of preachers. One, he says, preaches out of envy and rivalry and selfish ambition, and they just want to stir up trouble. The other, Paul says, they preach out of goodwill and in love. But notice what Paul says about this. You got preachers preaching out of good motives, preachers preaching out of bad motives. But look what he says in verse 18, and this is incredible. He says, but what does it matter? What does it matter what other people are doing? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of this, I rejoice. Wow. In other words, Paul was saying, I'm not going to let others keep me from doing what I'm supposed to be doing. God is the one who gets the glory, and so the results are his. Why should I worry about what other people think? My responsibility, Paul says, is to be obedient. You know, it's easy to become critical and bitter when we see others advancing up the ladder while we're still stuck on the bottom. It's easy to get jealous, especially when we know that the people who have advanced have clawed and lied and step on others to get to where they are. But the book of Proverbs warns us in Proverbs 24, verse 1, do not envy wicked men, do not desire their company. The temptation, however, is to wonder why I am not being blessed for doing right while other people seem to be blessed for doing wrong. And thinking that way gets life all out of focus. And so ask yourself the following questions. Are you following God? Even though things may not be going the way you think they should right now, are you following God? Do you desire his plan for your life? Are you asking him for wisdom and direction? Are you committed to him? And if you answer yes to those questions, just continue to do what you're doing, even if it looks like things are not working out. Continue to do what God has called you to do and leave the results to God. You see, that's how you rejoice in the middle of a difficult circumstance. Other people may look at your life and say, what are you doing? It's not worth your time. You wasted your life. But from your perspective, you're following God. And so you know that since you're following God, the way to keep your focus on God and not what's going around you is to recognize that things happen for a reason. And then leave the results to God. Those are the first two of 5 things that Paul says in the rest of this chapter about his perspective, how he was able to stay focused, how he was able to keep doing what he was doing, even from a prison cell, and even finding opportunities to rejoice in it. And so there's 5 secrets. The 2 that we looked at today are recognize things happen for a reason and leave the results to God. And we'll look at the other 3 tomorrow. Make sure to comment in the sections and be good to hear from you. And I look forward to seeing you again Thursday. So have a good day.